The Minnesota 2026 U.S. Senate race is heating up. We now have another Democrat who has jumped in this race to replace outgoing Senator Tina Smith. Now, we know Tina Smith. She was initially appointed back in 2018 by Governor Tim Walz at the time because Al Franken had resigned. She had to run in 2018 to win a seat. She then had to run again in 2020 to win a full 6 years in the Senate. She was able to win that election by about 5.5 points here. Now, she announced that she will not be running for re-election in 2026. This will be the first time Minnesota has not had an incumbent senator since 2006. It'll be 20 years since this. And this will probably be the most competitive Senate election since 2008. Maybe most competitive statewide election since 2010. It's like it was pretty competitive, Al Franken versus Norm Coleman, when Al Franken won by like 300 votes or something like that. Then I think on the governor's side, I think it was pretty competitive back in 2010. Yeah, Mark Dayton and Tom Emmer, that's right. That was a pretty competitive race back in 2010. But anyways, we know Angie Craig is running for the U.S. Senate now. She has announced her candidacy, which is really joining a pretty competitive field at this point. You now have Melisa López Franzen, who is the former state senator and Senate minority leader for 2 years. You have Peggy Flanagan, who's the current lieutenant governor of Minnesota, and now Angie Craig, who is the U.S. representative for Minnesota's 2nd congressional district. Now, Angie Craig was definitely seen as this hand-picked appointee by Tim Walz. She is much more in the Tim Walz lane than she is on the Peggy Flanagan lane. It's very safe to say that. And she comes into this race with a very, very big advantage. She has almost $1.2 million cash on hand. She raised a ton of money for her re-election. Now, ultimately, we don't have this in here simply because she only announced a couple days ago. This was done March 31st. But ultimately, she will come into this race with over $1 million of cash on hand to spend. And this primary is going to get pretty heated. I can't tell you the last time we had a pretty heated statewide primary like this. Now, depending on who wins the Democrat primary is really going to depend on if this race will be competitive. If Angie Craig wins this race, I don't see it being that competitive statewide. If Peggy Flanagan wins, I can definitely see this being a pretty tight race where national Republicans are pouring a lot of money into the state. Now, Angie Craig, she is a 4-term representative from Minnesota, initially elected back in 2018 in Minnesota's 2nd congressional district. Now, she won re-election in 2020 by a pretty close margin, won in 22 by a even bigger margin, and then had her biggest margin of victory in 2024 by about 13.5 points. You can clearly see that Minnesota, the rural portions, are trending more red. In the cities, we're trending much more to the right. To the left. Ultimately, this was still considered a toss-up race in 2024, but simply because Angie Craig is much more of a moderate relative to the people in her party, like Keith Ellison, like Ilhan Omar, like Peggy Flanagan, who are much more left than she is. She is much more moderate in her policy positions that he takes. And you can see that by the fact that she's winning by pretty big margins in a district that we thought would be relatively competitive. But the good news is that could mean we could have a competitive race in Minnesota's 2nd congressional district without an incumbent there. Now, she announced on April 29th that she will be running for the Senate in Minnesota to replace retiring Senator Tina Smith. Now, Craig really positions herself as this moderate. Talks about fighting to lower costs, safer communities, and just fighting against Trump policies in general. In her initial speech or her campaign video that she rolled out, she really criticizes Trump for, quote, trampling on our rights and freedoms as he profits, and Elon Musk as, quote, an out-of-control, unelected billionaire trying to take control of our government and burn it to the ground, and cowardly congressional Republicans. You know, I'm going to agree with you on cowardly congressional Republicans. They've been cowards for years. You know, they're refusing to codify any of Trump's executive orders. But it's kind of a joke to say that Donald Trump is, quote, trampling on our rights and freedoms as he profits. No. You want to line Donald Trump against any... During Trump's first administration, he lost net worth. You look at Obama. He went in with like what, $1 million net worth, left with like a $10 million net worth. Bill Clinton had like a $700,000 net worth, left with like a $40 million net worth. So spare me the crocodile tears about how Donald Trump is just sitting here trying to profit and how Elon Musk is out of control. You look, I could agree that yes, did Elon go with a sledgehammer into some things that he needed to use a chisel on? Absolutely, I agree. But ultimately, those were rectified. And to say that he's an unelected billionaire trying to take control of our government and burn it to the ground, I don't think so. I think he's trying to make it more efficient. It's kind of weird. Why is it that, Democrats were all about waste, fraud, and abuse? Oh, we got to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse until actually someone does something about it. Then they're, we can't do that. What about the unelected billionaires on the Democrat side? Democrats have about 4 or 5 times as much support from billionaires as Republicans do. So at least she's not saying that, we're fighting the oligarchy here like AOC is. But ultimately, it's kind of a joke. It really is. But ultimately, this is something that resonates with voters, unfortunately, at the end of the day. But she really tries to position herself as, like we said, this underdog. She grew up in a mobile home. She worked her way through college, and she fought like hell to defeat a member of Congress, and then fought like hell to have kids because she is a lesbian. She has 4 adult children, I believe. But this is a growing field of Democrat candidates that are looking to replace Tina Smith. It's going to get pretty tight. It's going to get pretty tough for Democrats. But we know, like we said, she already raised $1.2 million in the first quarter. Even though she hadn't announced yet, it was for her congressional campaign, which gives her a pretty strong fiscal start. We know that her opponents only raised like $300. Look at this. Peggy Flanagan has about $360,000 cash on hand. Melisa Franzen has about $250,000 cash on hand going into April. Now, Craig is going to face a pretty tough primary because we know in the primaries, they go to the left. You go to your base. And in Minnesota, they have a strong base of liberals, a super strong base of far left, extreme progressive liberals. Now, Angie Craig has picked up a number of endorsements, and they don't have them all on here. Wow, you can see state representatives have really started to pull out for Peggy Flanagan. But ultimately, she's picked up the endorsement of Dean Phillips. Also, the son of former Senator Paul Wellstone, of David Wellstone, has come out and endorsed her. She has picked up a number of endorsements, especially with like labor unions. That's been a very strong point. She has a lot of union support. There's no doubt about that. She has a lot of union support. But ultimately, she is going to have to compete in the primary against Peggy Flanagan, who is a progressive, who has endorsements from people like Al Franken, Keith Ellison. I know Omar's not on here, but she most likely will have the support of Ilhan Omar. But she also has to run against Melisa López France, who is much more of I think you'd say a fiscal moderate, much more in the middle. But ultimately, I think Angie Craig wins that race between the moderates, between Melisa López France and Angie Craig. Angie Craig wins that. She has much more name recognition statewide, but it's going to be a grueling and really expensive primary. But now we have to take a step back from this election and really see, how is this going to affect the overall map? That's the big question here. Obviously, we know Democrats are in a pretty bad position structurally to win control of the Senate. As of right now, I have their ceiling at 49 seats. Even if they won all the swing states or the swing races, they're still at a 49 ceiling. Where are they going? Maybe Alaska if they want to get to 50, but I just don't see that happening. So I have the Democrat ceiling right about 49 seats, even if they pick everything up that's on the table. They take all the cards that are on the table. But in Minnesota, if Angie Craig is in this race, if she is leading the ticket in Minnesota, I would move this from a lean Democrat to a likely Democrat seat. Angie Craig is seen much more as a moderate, especially if Republicans nominate someone like Royce White. Royce White is just going to get smoked. That guy is such a loser. He shouldn't even be in this race. After an embarrassing loss to Amy Klobuchar in 2024, you shouldn't even be allowed back in politics if you have that bad of a loss, if we're being 100% honest. If you're going to lose by 7, if you trail behind Trump by 13, 14 points, I think your political career should honestly be over if I'm being 100% honest. But We've talked about this. Peggy Flanagan's leading the ticket. I have this as a lean, even a slight Democrat advantage. Democrats could win by 2, 3, 4 points, but Angie Craig's in this race, has a lot more blue collar support, can have a lot of union work or union support. I just see it going likely Democratic, especially considering the environment that we're going to go into. It's going to be anti-Republican, anti-Trump. We know the party in power does not do well in the midterms. We're expecting that to happen. And I think that would just play into Angie Craig's cards. And that's why she feels this is the perfect opportunity to run for Senate. Because Minnesota is a blue-leaning state. But Republicans, they do see an opportunity with no incumbent. Because the last Republican senator to win an election, I believe, was Norm Coleman back in 2002. Let's see if I can get that. 2002. Yeah, last time. He beat out Walter Mondale. Now, this was kind of a sad election here because Paul Wellstone was the incumbent senator here. Paul Wellstone died in a plane crash. Actually, the day Norm Coleman and Paul Wellstone were supposed to debate, the former Vice President Walter Mondale replaced him on the ticket. Still only lost by about 2 percentage points here. But ultimately, it was tough. But Republicans were able to flip this seat from Democrat control to Republican control, just considering the tragedy that did happen. Now, a crowded primary could drain Democrat resources, which would give Republicans, a slight chance. And Craig's departure from the House will make her seat most likely competitive again, split in Democrat focus. But also, if Tim Walz decides to run, I think that's going to put for governor, it's going to put a lot more focus back on the Senate race, because that's been the big thing in Minnesota. We have the Senate race and we also have the governor's race. We didn't know if Tim Walz was going to run for re-election. I'd say the fact that Angie Craig is jumping in this race shows that Walz is running for re-election. That would be my take as of right now. But her seat would be most likely competitive again. Maybe not within a point or two, but I think you could see it competitive. Look, Craig won by 13 points. Just a couple years ago, this was a seat, the one election, I guess, before the redistrict. Craig only won it by 5 percentage points. So we could easily see this become a tight election. Again, you go back to 2018. Obviously, you have a different vote share right here, but ultimately, Craig won by 5 points in that race. So I think that we could see it a lot closer than what we would see in the 2024 election, just considering there will no longer be an incumbent. But Democrats are still favored to hold the Senate seat. Like I said, we have this as a lean Democrat seat as of right now. We need to let this play out a little bit more. Ultimately, if Craig is leading the ticket, this is going to be a likely Democrat seat. So the 2026 election, I want to say it's going to decide control of the Senate, but it's not. It's not. Republicans are still going to control it at the end of the day. It's just going to depend how big is their margin. Democrats are stuck defending, I believe, 13 seats, while Republicans are defending a lot of seats in GOP safe seats. Now, Minnesota's open seat is one of 4 Democrat retirements that does make it a battleground where they don't have an incumbent. Minnesota, Michigan, New Hampshire. What am I forgetting here? Oh, of course, then Dick Durbin. How could you forget about that loser? But Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, New Hampshire. Obviously, Minnesota, Michigan, New Hampshire, that's where it could be competitive. Illinois, we don't think it's going to be competitive at all. But Michigan and Georgia, those are 2 states that were won by Donald Trump in the 2024 election. There's going to be a lot of money poured into these races here. Because ultimately, Republicans do want to expand control. They don't want to be stuck at 53. They want to get to 55, 54, 55, 56 seats. And a Republican win here would help the GOP expand their majority, but there's a lot that would have to line up for the GOP to win. And as of right now, I'm not willing to even say that that's a possibility of happening here. But Craig's ability to win in these tough races will keep, and most likely will keep this seat in Democrat control, but the primary's outcome is critical. We could see Minnesota just go super far to the left, pick someone like Peggy Flanagan. This could be a competitive race. So that's going to wrap things up for today, folks. Let me know your thoughts down below, and as always, we'll catch you next time.